They didn't even let me speak. That's the part I still dream about, not the decision itself, not the final tally, not the way the chamber lights dimmed to signal that the vote was closed. It's the fact that I was standing at the podium, mouth open, first syllable of the first word of a 30-page defense already forming on my tongue, and the presidium chair activated the sound-dampening field around the human delegation's platform before I could finish a breath. My name is James Morrow. I was 31 years old, Earth's youngest appointed galactic liaison, and I had spent 412 days preparing a legal brief that would prove humanity deserved its provisional seat on the Council of Aligned Civilizations. I never delivered a single word of it. The vote was 11-1. 11 species voted to permanently exclude Earth from membership. 1 abstained. Nobody voted in our favor. The abstention came from the Tisari, and even they wouldn't meet my eyes when I looked across the chamber afterward. What I remember most clearly is the sound, not silence. The dampening field didn't create silence. It created a pressurized hum, like being inside a sealed room while a storm hammered the walls. I could hear my own heartbeat in my skull. I could hear Travis Chen, my deputy, cursing behind me. I could hear my own breathing accelerate. What I could not hear was the reason. The Presidium published the formal exclusion rationale 6 hours later. Species 4417-H, Terran, Sol 3, demonstrates persistent cultural instability, unresolved intraspecific aggression patterns, and insufficient centralized governance continuity to warrant membership privileges under Article 9 of the Aligned Charter. Persistent cultural instability, unresolved intraspecific aggression, insufficient governance continuity. 3 phrases, 11 votes, 400 years of human spacefaring, dismissed in a paragraph. I stood on the observation deck of the council station and watched Earth, a marble of blue and white and green, impossibly small at that distance, and felt something I had never felt before. Not anger. Anger is hot, and this was cold, not grief. Grief makes you smaller, and this was making me larger. It was something architectural, something that wanted to build. Travis found me an hour later. He had the formal exclusion document in his hand, still warm from the diplomatic printer. His jaw was tight, his eyes red, and his voice was perfectly steady. "So what do we do?" I didn't answer for a long time. Then I said, "We make our own." I need you to understand something before I continue. I was not a visionary. I was not a revolutionary. I was a mid-career diplomatic functionary with a degree in xenolegal studies from Georgetown and a secondment to the Galactic Liaison Bureau that was supposed to last 3 years. I had good performance reviews. I made competent briefs. I was organized, punctual, and adequate. The thing I built after the vote did not come from genius. It came from the fact that I was the person standing in the room when the door closed, and I happened to have the institutional memory to know where the tools were. The first 6 months were humiliating. I returned to Earth and requested a meeting with the Secretary General. I got a deputy assistant scheduling coordinator. I submitted a formal proposal to the Bureau for the establishment of an independent interstellar cooperation framework. It sat in a review queue for 11 weeks. I was reassigned to a desk that handled agricultural export licensing for off-world freight. Agricultural exports. I had stood in the highest diplomatic chamber in the galaxy, and now I was stamping permits for soybean shipments to mining stations. Travis quit the Bureau entirely and went private sector logistics consulting for the Helios Dry Dock Consortium. He told me I was wasting my time. He was right at that point. What changed was the Resk. The Resk were a minor species, 8 billion individuals spread across 2 systems on the far side of the Orion Transit Corridor. Amphibian biology, methane tolerant, brilliant chemists. They had been denied council membership 4 times in 2 centuries. Nobody remembered why the first denial happened, and by the 4th cycle it had become institutional habit. The Resk were on nobody's strategic map. Their ambassador to the council, a being named Torek Voss, contacted me through a back channel 7 months after the vote. The message was 13 words long. "We heard what happened. We were not surprised. We have an idea." I almost deleted it. I was processing soybean permits. I was tired. I was beginning to believe that the exclusion was something that would be studied by future academics and mourned at diplomatic anniversaries and ultimately accepted as the shape of the galaxy. I answered Torek's message at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in Geneva, sitting in my apartment in my underwear eating cold rice from a container. Tell me. Torek Voss was not what I expected. I had spent my career studying the major council species, the Kailori, the Bravari, the Valith, the Ascendancy clans. I knew their histories, their legal doctrines, their aesthetic preferences. I could calibrate a diplomatic address to Kailori emotional register or Bravari hierarchical protocol. I knew nothing about the rest. Torek arrived at the Geneva meeting in a pressurized mobility frame that smelled faintly of ammonia and made a soft hydraulic wheezing when he moved. He was smaller than I expected, barely chest height on me. His eyes were enormous, multifaceted, a deep amber that caught light and multiplied it. He spoke through a translator module that gave his voice a slightly musical quality, like a cello played through water. He brought 3 other ambassadors with him, not Resk, not human. Severin Kale represented the Morith, a crystalline species from a high-gravity world that the Council had classified as pre-aligned for 60 years without ever advancing their application. He moved slowly, deliberately, every gesture suggesting that time was a resource he controlled rather than one that controlled him. Drell Hastak represented the Orvani nomadic, ship-dwelling, no-home world. The Council had denied them standing on the grounds that a species without planetary sovereignty could not exercise territorial governance. They had been living in interstellar space for 900 years. And Caleb Meng, human. I hadn't expected a human. Caleb was 53, former merchant marine, currently operating a freight logistics network that connected 17 non-council systems through informal trade agreements he had been building for a decade. He had no government affiliation. He had no diplomatic credentials. What he had was a map, an actual physical hand-drawn map on synthetic paper of every trade route, supply depot, relay station, and resource exchange point that operated outside council jurisdiction. "You're the soybean guy," Caleb said when I sat down. "Agricultural export licensing," I corrected. "Right, the soybean guy." He unrolled his map across the table. "Look at this." I looked. It was a mess. Lines in different colors, annotations in 3 scripts, margin notes in Caleb's cramped handwriting, supply flows, transit corridors, fuel costs, population nodes, a network that existed in the spaces between council territories, linking species the council had rejected or ignored or never noticed. "How long have you been building this?" I asked. "I haven't been building anything," Caleb said. "I've been watching it grow. This isn't a plan. This is what's already happening. 17 species, 81 billion individuals, trading, cooperating, sharing technology, sharing food, sharing medical data, all without council permission, council infrastructure, or council awareness. The only thing missing is a name and a charter." Torek leaned forward. "The council is not the galaxy, Mr. Morrow. The council is 32 species who drew a circle around themselves and called everything inside it civilization. Outside that circle, life continued, commerce continued, innovation continued, cooperation continued. You were not excluded from civilization, you were excluded from a club." I stared at the map. 17 species, 81 billion individuals, trade routes I'd never heard of, technology exchanges that appeared nowhere in the Bureau's databases. "What exactly are you proposing?" I said. "We are proposing that you design the thing we already are," Torek said. "We don't need a revolution, we need architecture. Building a charter from scratch is harder than it sounds." "No, it's harder than it sounds even after you've adjusted for how hard it sounds. The Council of Aligned Civilizations had a charter that was 1,200 years old, amended 4,000 times, interpreted by 17 generations of legal scholars, and enforced by a fleet of 900 warships. It was massive, contradictory, and functional in the way that old cities are functional, not because anyone designed it well, but because enough people had lived inside it long enough to wear paths through its worst inefficiencies. I had nothing. I had a conference table in Geneva, 6 representatives of species that didn't trust each other, a hand-drawn map, and my own xeno-legal training. The first argument started 20 minutes into the first session and lasted 3 days. The Morith wanted a hierarchical structure, a central authority with binding power. The Orvani wanted no structure at all, a loose confederation of voluntary participants. The Resk wanted something in between. Caleb wanted whatever works fastest. And I wanted something that wouldn't collapse the first time someone disagreed. I spent 72 hours mediating. I slept 4 hours total. I drank enough coffee to dissolve a hull plate. And at the end of it, I had 2 paragraphs of agreed text and a migraine. The 2 paragraphs said this. 1. Any species, regardless of political structure, territorial holdings, or biological classification, may petition for membership in this cooperative framework. 2. No species shall be required to surrender sovereignty, alter governance, or conform to a single cultural standard as a condition of membership. 2 paragraphs. 3 days. I thought it was a failure. Torek told me it was the most important document he had seen in his lifetime. The Council's charter begins with exclusion criteria, he said. Yours begins with a door. That is not a small difference. We called it the Pact of Open Seas. The name was Caleb's idea. He said it came from old Earth maritime law, the principle that the ocean belonged to everyone and no single nation could claim it. I thought it was too human-centric. Torek thought it was perfect. We are not trying to be neutral, Torek said. We are trying to be honest. A human built this. Humans should name it. The first formal signing happened 14 months after the Council vote, in a repurposed cargo bay on a Resk orbital station. There were no flags, no ceremony, no press corps. 7 species signed: Earth, the Resk, the Morith, the Orvani, and 3 others who had joined the process in the intervening months. The Vallani, deep space miners from a tidally locked world. The Thasari, insectoid engineers whose council application had been pending for 90 years. And the Cathari, a species of 3 billion individuals living inside a hollowed asteroid cluster who the Council had never even bothered to deny. They simply weren't aware the Cathari existed. 7 species, approximately 94 billion individuals. I stood in that cargo bay, holding a stylus over a display screen, and felt the same cold thing I had felt on the observation deck after the vote. Not anger, not triumph. Something structural, something that was already bigger than me. I signed. The first 3 years were the good years. I say that now with the clarity of someone who has been walking for a long time and can see the terrain behind him. At the time, I didn't know they were the good years. I thought they were the hard years. I thought the difficulty of building an interstellar cooperation framework from nothing, with no budget, no fleet, no institutional history, and no leverage, was the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part was what came after it worked. By year 2, 14 species had signed the pact. By year 3, 23. The growth was not linear. It was exponential, driven by a feedback loop I had not anticipated. Each new member brought trade connections which attracted more species, which expanded the network, which made membership more valuable, which attracted more species. Caleb's map, which had covered one wall of the Geneva conference room, now required a dedicated holographic projection system that filled an entire chamber on the new administrative station we'd built in the Tessari neutral zone. The Tessari themselves, the species that had abstained from the council vote, joined the pact in year 3, and their participation gave us something we desperately needed: legitimacy in the eyes of species that still considered the council the center of galactic civilization. I should have been celebrating. Sometimes I was. There were nights on the administrative station. We called it the Forge, because Caleb said that's what it was, when I would stand in the operations center and watch the real-time trade flow display and feel something close to joy. Lines of light connecting systems, resources moving, knowledge exchanging, species that had never communicated before discovering mutual advantage. It was beautiful. But beauty has a shadow, and I was beginning to see it. The 23rd species to join was the Selvari remnant, the surviving population of a species that had been vassalized by the Valith Dominion 2 centuries earlier. They were desperate, scattered across 3 refugee stations with failing life support and a dwindling population of 800 million. They came to the pact not because they believed in our principles, but because they needed someone to say yes. I said yes. I said yes because the pact began with a door, and I could not close it without becoming the thing that had closed the door on me. That decision cost us. The Valith Dominion considered the Selvari their property, not metaphorically, literally. Under Council law, the Selvari had been reclassified as a managed population under Valith administrative oversight. The legal term was protective integration. The practical reality was indentured labor. When the Pact extended membership to the Selvari, the Valith ambassador to the Council delivered a formal protest. When we didn't withdraw, the Dominion redirected 3 patrol groups to the border of Pact-affiliated space. When we still didn't withdraw, the Dominion placed a trade embargo on any Council species conducting commerce with Pact members. Our first real crisis, and I had caused it. Travis Chen came back into my life during the embargo. He showed up at the forge unannounced, 3 years older, 15 pounds heavier, wearing a private sector suit that cost more than my monthly salary. He found me in the operations center at 3 a.m., staring at the trade flow display and watching the lines that connected us to Council-adjacent systems blink out one by one as the embargo took hold. "You look terrible," he said. "I'm watching our economy collapse in real time." "It's not collapsing. It's contracting." He sat down beside me. "I've been tracking your numbers. You're losing about 12% of external trade volume. Internal trade is actually up. Your member species are compensating by trading more with each other. That's not collapse, that's consolidation. 12% is enough to destabilize 3 of our newer members. Then stabilize them." He pulled out a data pad. "I didn't come here to sympathize. I came here because Helios Drydock wants to build you a shipyard." I stared at him. A shipyard. "The consortium has been watching the Pact for 18 months. Your trade volume is impressive, but your logistics infrastructure is improvised. You're moving goods on converted cargo haulers and refurbished mining vessels. Helios can build you a proper yard, construction, maintenance, standardized fleet. In exchange, they want preferred contractor status for Pact commercial vessels. That's an enormous investment for a preferred contractor deal." Travis smiled. It was the smile I remembered from our diplomatic days. The one that meant he had already calculated every angle. "James, the Council just embargoed you. Every Council-affiliated shipyard is now off-limits to Pact-flagged vessels. You have 23 species and no capacity to build your own ships. Helios isn't making an investment. They're making the only play that makes sense." I looked at the trade flow display, the vanishing lines, the contracting network. "What's the catch?" I said. "No catch, just a question." He leaned forward. "How big do you actually want this to get?" I didn't answer. I didn't know yet. But I felt the architecture shifting inside me, the cold structural thing that had lived in my chest since the vote, and it was not contracting. It was expanding. It was hungry. That hunger is what I should have been afraid of. By year 5, the Pact of Open Seas had 41 member species and a combined population of 312 billion individuals. I'll let that number sit for a moment, because I don't think I understood it at the time. 312 billion. The Council of Aligned Civilizations represented approximately 1.8 trillion individuals, but they had been building for 12 centuries. The Pact had been building for 5 years. We had our own shipyard, 3 actually, and after the Thesari offered to build 2 more using their engineering expertise. We had a shared communications network that Caleb's logistics teams had woven together from Orvani relay technology, RESC encryption protocols, and human signal processing. We had a mutual defense agreement, not a military alliance. I was careful about that distinction, though the distinction was getting thinner every month. We had a currency exchange system, a joint research initiative, a standardized medical database, and a growing diplomatic corps staffed by volunteers from every member species. And we had a problem. The problem's name was Brock Harlan. Brock was a career military officer, Earth Naval Command, 30 years of service, retired as a vice admiral. He had been appointed by Earth's government as the Pact's Director of Security Coordination 18 months earlier, over my objection. I wanted a civilian in the role. Earth's government wanted someone who could build a fleet. I lost that argument. I lost it because the Valith embargo had made the case for me. The Pact needed the ability to defend itself, and civilians don't build fleets. Brock was good at his job. That was the problem. In 18 months, he had organized the Pact's scattered defense assets into a coherent force structure. He had established patrol routes, training protocols, shared tactical doctrine. He had convinced the Thesari to design a new class of patrol corvette, the Threshold class that could be built quickly and crewed by mixed species teams.
He had done everything I asked him to do and several things I hadn't. The thing I hadn't asked him to do was build a forward operating base in the Rathani Gap, the narrow corridor between Velith Dominion space and the Pact's outer territories. It's a defensive position, Brock told me when I confronted him. We were in the Forge's command center, just the two of us. He was standing, I was sitting. He did that deliberately, positioned himself so I had to look up. It's a provocation, I said. It's a deterrent. The Velith have been probing our border for 6 months, 3 incursions last quarter. They're testing our response capability. I know what they're testing. I read the same reports you do. Then you know we need a forward position. Response time from our nearest patrol station is 14 hours. That's 14 hours of uncontested access for anyone who wants to hit our trade lanes. Brock and I didn't build this framework so we could play border games with the Dominion. He looked at me. Not hostile, not dismissive, patient. The patience of a man who has had this conversation before with other civilians who thought they could build something in the galaxy without defending it. James, you built a house. I'm putting a lock on the door. You can argue about whether the lock is too big or in the wrong place, but you can't argue that the door should stay open. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that the Pact was fundamentally different from the Council, that our strength was our openness, our refusal to mirror the exclusionary logic of the species that had locked us out. I wanted to say that the moment we started building military infrastructure on contested borders, we stopped being a cooperative framework and started being a power block. I didn't say any of it because I could see the trade flow display behind him, and I could see the incursion alerts 3 in the last quarter, just as he'd said, and I could see the vulnerability. I could see that Brock was right. I authorized the forward base. The 42nd species to join the Pact was the Dreven hierarchy. The Dreven were not a minor species. They were not refugees, not rejects, not forgotten. They were a major interstellar civilization, 400 billion individuals, 12 core systems, a military fleet of genuine capability. They had been full council members for 6 centuries. They left the council to join us. The news broke across every communication network in the galaxy simultaneously. The council held an emergency session. The Velith Dominion recalled its ambassador from 3 neutral stations. The Brevari issued a formal inquiry into whether the Pact constituted a parallel governance structure under Article 17 of the Aligned Charter, the article that prohibited the formation of rival political entities. I sat in my office on the Forge and stared at the Dreven membership petition on my desk and felt the architecture in my chest shift again. Not expand this time. Buckle. The Dreven ambassador, a tall, angular being named Korath Sen, had requested a private meeting before the formal signing. I granted it. He arrived with no staff, no security, no entourage. Just himself, folding into the chair across from my desk with the fluid precision of someone bred for formal spaces. "You're wondering why," he said. "I'm wondering why now. Because the Council voted last month to extend the Velith's protective integration mandate to 2 additional species. Both minor, both unable to resist, both in systems adjacent to Pact territory." He paused. "The Council is not merely excluding you, Mr. Morrow. It is encircling you, and it is using the legal tools of protection to do so. And the Dreven care about this because we voted against the extension and were overruled 11-4. Because the same legal mechanism that allows the Velith to absorb minor species can be turned on any council member that becomes inconvenient. Because the council has spent 12 centuries building a system that concentrates power, and the Pact, your Pact, is the first structure in that time that distributes it." I studied him. Korath Sen was old by Dreven standards, which meant ancient by human ones. His skin had the translucent quality of deep age, fine lines mapping decades of political calculation across his face. "Ambassador Sen, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask." "Are you joining the Pact because you believe in it, or because you're using it as leverage against the Council?" He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He sat very still for a long moment, and then he said, "Both. And I suspect you already knew that. The question is whether it matters." It mattered. I just didn't know how to make it matter without closing the door. 2 paragraphs. Any species may petition. No species shall be required to conform. The founding principle. The thing that made us different. I accepted the Dreven. Year 7 was when I started losing sleep. Not metaphorically, literally. I developed a pattern where I would fall asleep at my desk, jolt awake 2 hours later with my heart hammering, and spend the next 4 hours reading reports that all said the same thing in different ways. The pact was succeeding, and the success was deforming it. 49 member species, 420 billion individuals, 3 shipyards, a patrol fleet of 200 vessels, a communications network that now rivaled the Council's in coverage if not in bandwidth, a joint research program that had produced breakthroughs in energy storage, atmospheric processing, and medical genomics, a trade volume that had tripled in 2 years, and factions. I had never planned for factions. The Charter didn't address factions. The pact was built on voluntary participation and open membership. The assumption was that species would cooperate because cooperation served their interests, and if it stopped serving their interests, they would leave. Clean, simple, architecturally elegant. What actually happened was that species didn't leave when they disagreed. They formed blocks. The first block was the originals, the founding 7 species led informally by Torek Voss, who argued that the pact's principles should remain fixed and that growth should be moderated to preserve the framework's character. They wanted membership criteria. They wanted slower integration. They wanted the door to remain open, but with a longer hallway. The second block was the expansionists led, whether he admitted it or not, by Brock Harlan, who argued that the pact's survival depended on becoming large enough and strong enough to deter the Council from ever acting against it. Bigger fleet, more members, more infrastructure, more power. The third block was the Dreven coalition Korath Sen and the 7 species that had followed the Dreven out of the Council. They wanted the pact to formalize into a genuine political entity with binding authority, centralized decision-making, and diplomatic standing equivalent to the Council itself. They wanted, in other words, a competing empire. 3 factions, 3 visions. And me in the middle, holding a charter that said any species may petition and no species shall be required to conform, and watching those 2 principles tear at each other like tectonic plates. The fracture became visible during the Thalvine crisis. The Thalvine were a minor species, 600 million individuals on a single habitable moon in a system claimed by the Bravari conquered. They had been requesting Council protection from Bravari resource extraction for decades and had been denied each time. When they petitioned to join the pact, 34 of our 49 members voted to accept. Accepting meant extending our mutual defense agreement to a species inside Bravari claimed space. The originals voted against. Torek Voss argued correctly that accepting the Thalvine would be interpreted as a territorial claim inside Council space and would guarantee military confrontation. He argued correctly that the pact was not designed for this. He argued correctly that I was allowing the framework's success to outpace its structural integrity. I overruled him. I overruled him because 800 Thalvine refugees had arrived at the Forge in a ship with failing life support, and one of them was carrying a child who had been born during the transit, and the child had been named Morrow, named after me, after the man who built the door. I couldn't close it. Torek came to see me that evening. He didn't knock. He wheeled his mobility frame into my office, positioned himself directly across from my desk, and waited until I looked up. "You're making decisions with your biography," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means you are so afraid of becoming the Council that you cannot see when the Council's critique of you is correct." The words hit like ice water. "They said we were unstable," I said quietly. "Culturally unstable, ungovernable. And you are proving them right. Not because humans are unstable, but because you, James, you specifically, are building a structure that cannot say no, and a structure that cannot say no will be consumed by the first thing that asks for everything." We took in the Selvari. That worked. The Selvari had nowhere else to go. The Dreven had everywhere else to go. They chose you because you are useful. The Thalvine chose you because you are sympathetic. These are not the same motivation, and your charter treats them identically, and that is going to break. I stared at him. Torek's enormous amber eyes held mine without blinking, multifaceted surfaces catching the office light and fracturing it into small golden fires. "What would you have me do?" I asked. "I would have you write a third paragraph. A third paragraph. Your charter has 2 founding statements. They are beautiful. They are also insufficient. You need a third that says, membership in this framework carries obligations as well as rights, and the framework reserves the capacity to define those obligations as conditions of participation. That's a membership criterion. That's an exclusion mechanism. Yes. That's what the council has. The council also has walls and floors and a roof. The fact that they built a prison with those materials does not mean that walls are evil. It means they used them badly. Torek leaned forward. James, you built a door, but a door in a wall leads somewhere. A door standing alone in a field is just a frame. I didn't write the third paragraph that night. I should have. Instead, I lay on the narrow cot in my office and stared at the ceiling and felt the architecture in my chest grinding against itself. The cold structural thing that had been growing since the vote, expanding, and now for the first time pressing against its own edges. The council offered to negotiate. Year 8. I was standing in the operations center, watching the trade flow display, which now required an entire wall and a dedicated rendering system when the message arrived through Tesserae diplomatic channels. A formal invitation. The Council of Aligned Civilizations requested bilateral talks with the Pact of Open Seas to discuss mutual recognition, boundary delineation, and the normalization of interstellar governance relations. Bilateral, that word, two sides, equals. The Council was acknowledging us. I should have felt triumph. 8 years earlier, they had silenced me at a podium and voted to exclude my species from galactic civilization. Now they were asking to sit across a table from me and talk. Instead, I felt the architecture shift again, and this time I recognized the sensation. It wasn't expansion or contraction or buckling. It was hunger. The cold thing in my chest looked at the Council's invitation and thought, leverage. That frightened me. I convened the Leadership Council, the informal body that had evolved from the original 7 signatories into a 20-member executive committee representing the Pact's major factions. The meeting lasted 11 hours. Brock Harlan wanted to negotiate from strength. We go in with our fleet numbers, our trade volume, our population statistics. We make them see the cost of continued antagonism. Korath Sen wanted to negotiate from equivalence. We demand formal recognition as a parallel sovereign entity with equal standing under interstellar law. Torek Voss wanted to negotiate from principle. We go in with our charter. We show them what we are. We do not perform power. Caleb Meng, who had become the Pact's informal trade commissioner, still carrying his hand-drawn map folded in his jacket pocket, even though it was years out of date, wanted to skip the negotiation entirely. They're not inviting us to talk. They're inviting us to be measured. Every number we show them is a number they can plan against. Travis Chen, who had officially joined the Pact's administrative staff in year 6 after his private sector contract expired, wanted a middle path. Go. Listen. Offer nothing. Learn everything. I went. The Council's negotiation station was called the Meridian. A massive, ancient structure in a neutral system that had hosted every major interstellar agreement for the last 7 centuries. Walking through its corridors felt like walking through a museum of my own exclusion. The walls displayed holographic records of treaties I had studied in school, agreements that had shaped the galaxy, documents signed by species that had looked at humanity and decided we weren't ready. The Council's delegation was led by a Bravari senior diplomat named Vasek Tone. I knew him by reputation, considered the finest negotiator in the aligned civilizations, responsible for brokering the Tesserae border accords and the Morvani resource-sharing agreement. He was tall, calm, with the Bravari's characteristic silver-gray skin and deep-set dark eyes that gave nothing away. We met across a circular table, their side, our side, the geometry of opposition built into the furniture. Mr. Morrow, Vasek said, the Council appreciates your willingness to engage. The Pact appreciates the invitation. You have built something impressive. 49 species in 8 years. The Council has taken formal notice. We noticed. A faint tilt of his head, almost a smile. I will be direct. The Council is prepared to offer the Pact formal recognition as an independent cooperative entity with reciprocal trade agreements, boundary guarantees, and a mutual non-aggression framework. In exchange, we ask for 3 things. He raised one long, thin finger. First, the Pact agrees to a mutual boundary, formalized and binding, with no further territorial expansion into council-claimed space, a second finger. Second, the pact agrees to a standardized mutual defense threshold. Neither entity will build military capacity beyond a defined ratio relative to the other, a third finger. Third, the pact agrees to membership criteria. A species must meet defined standards of governance, stability, and developmental capacity before being admitted. He lowered his hand. He watched me. I felt the architecture in my chest go very still, very quiet, like a machine that has been running for 8 years and suddenly recognizes its own sound. Membership criteria. The council was asking me to build a wall, to put conditions on the door, to define who was ready and who wasn't, the same definition they had used to lock me out. And the worst part, the part that I have thought about every day since, is that a portion of me wanted to say yes. Not because it was right, because it was useful. Because the Thalvine crisis had shown me what Torek had been warning about, that a door without conditions would eventually admit something the framework couldn't absorb. Because the factions were pulling the pact apart, and membership criteria would give me a tool to manage growth. Because I was tired, and the council was offering me the one thing I needed most. Limits. Limits I didn't have to design myself. Limits I could blame on someone else. I need to consult with my leadership, I said. Of course, Vasek said. Take whatever time you need. I returned to the forge and locked myself in my office for 3 days. On the second day, Caleb Mang broke into my office. I don't mean that metaphorically. He used a maintenance override code he'd gotten from a Tassari engineer and walked through my door at 4 a.m. while I was sitting on the floor surrounded by holographic projections of the council's proposal, the pact's charter, trade flow models, population graphs, and defense capability assessments. He looked at the mess. He looked at me. He sat down on the floor across from me. You're going to say yes, he said. I haven't decided. You're going to say yes because Vasek offered you the one thing you've been wanting for 3 years and couldn't admit, a reason to stop. I didn't respond. James, I've known you for 9 years. You're not a builder. You think you are, but you're not. Builders love what they make. You're afraid of what you've made. You've been afraid of it since the Dreven joined, and you've been looking for permission to put the brakes on ever since. That's exactly what's happening. Vasek didn't offer you a negotiation. He offered you an exit ramp. Take the deal, cap the growth, let someone else draw the lines, and you get to stop lying awake at night worrying that you've built a monster. The word hung in the air. Monster. Caleb, we have 420 billion people depending on a framework that doesn't have membership criteria, doesn't have binding authority, and doesn't have a defined military threshold. If someone joins who destabilizes the whole structure, then the structure adapts. That's what structures do when they're alive. Dead structures have rules, living structures have responses. That sounds good. It doesn't solve the Thalvine problem. The Thalvine problem is that you took in refugees and a major power got angry. That's not a structural failure, that's a Tuesday. The Council has had 17 wars in 12 centuries. They manage them. The question isn't whether you'll have crises, it's whether your crises will be worth having. He picked up the hand-drawn map from the floor. It was faded, creased, the ink barely visible. The original. The map of 17 species and 81 billion individuals that had seemed impossibly ambitious 8 years ago. You remember what Torek said at the first meeting? Caleb asked. He said a lot of things. He said, we don't need a revolution. We need architecture. He was right, but you heard it wrong. You heard, build me a building. What he meant was, build me a language. Build me a way for different species to talk to each other about what they need and what they can give. A language doesn't have walls, James. It has grammar. And grammar isn't exclusion. Grammar is how you make meaning out of chaos. I stared at the map. I'm losing the originals, I said. Torek wants membership criteria. If I refuse the Council's offer and refuse Torek's third paragraph, I lose the founding coalition. Maybe. Or maybe you write something better than a third paragraph. Like what? Like a question. Instead of telling species what they need to be to join, ask them what they're prepared to give. Make the commitment the criterion, not the characteristic. The Council measures what you are. The pact should measure what you're willing to do. He put the map on the floor between us. Two men sitting on the floor of an office at 4 a.m., surrounded by the holographic guts of an interstellar civilization, staring at a piece of synthetic paper with ink lines on it. "I don't know if that's enough," I said. "It's not enough, it's a start. Enough is something you build every day and never finish. That's the whole point. You don't get to be done. The council thinks it's done, that's why it's dying. You get to be ongoing." I rejected the council's offer. Not all of it. I accepted the mutual non-aggression framework and the reciprocal trade agreements. I rejected the boundary freeze, the military cap, and the membership criteria. In their place, I proposed something that I designed over 3 sleepless nights with input from Torek, Caleb, Brock, Travis, Korath, and the Leadership Council's full 20-member body. We called it the Obligation Framework. Instead of criteria for joining, we established commitments for membership. Any species could still petition. The door remained open. But walking through it meant agreeing to specific, measurable obligations, contributing to collective defense proportional to capability, participating in mutual aid during crises, sharing certain categories of scientific and medical data, and the hardest one, the one that nearly broke the Leadership Council, submitting to independent review if a member species was accused of internal practices that violated the Pact's founding principles. That last one was aimed at the Dreven. Korath Sen knew it. He sat across from me in the chamber and read the clause and met my eyes, and in that look I saw him recalculate everything: his investment, his leverage, his long-term plan. "You're asking us to open our internal governance to external review," he said. "I'm asking every member species to accept that membership carries weight," I said, "including Earth. Earth does not practice the Dreven's hierarchical caste system. No, but Earth has its own failures, and if a member species formally accuses us of violating founding principles, we submit to the same review, no exceptions, including us." Silence. 20 beings in a room, representing 49 species, watching 2 of them negotiate the soul of the thing they'd built. And if we refuse, then the Pact is what Torek warned me it would be: a door standing alone in a field, a frame with nothing behind it. Korath studied me for a long time. "You've changed," he said. "When we met, you were a man who couldn't say no. Now you're a man who can say no, but has found a way to do it without closing the door." Is that a yes? It's a recognition. The answer is yes. But you should know that I will spend the next decade testing every seam in that framework, because a structure that cannot survive testing was never worth joining. I'd expect nothing less. The obligation framework passed 39 to 10. The 10 dissenters remain members. Disagreement was not grounds for exclusion. The framework was amended, refined, and implemented over the next 6 months. Torek never got his 3rd paragraph, but he told me privately that the obligation framework was better than what he'd asked for. "I asked for a wall," he said. "You built a floor." Year 10, the year everything I'd built was tested. The Council's response to my rejection of their boundary and criteria proposals was measured, public, and devastating. They didn't attack. They didn't embargo. They did something worse. They offered a unilateral open membership provision to any Pact member species that wanted to transfer to the Council. No criteria, no waiting period, no conditions. Any species currently in the Pact could join the Council immediately with full membership privileges. The trap was elegant. Vasek Tone and I had no doubt this was his design, understood the Pact's architecture better than I wanted to admit. By offering unconditional membership, the Council was doing what it had never done before, opening its own door. And by opening it specifically to our members, it was testing whether the Pact's cohesion was built on principle or on the absence of alternatives. 5 species defected in the first month. None of them were founding members. None of them were major players. But the number 5 sent a shockwave through the Pact. If 5 could leave, how many more were considering it? If the Council was willing to accept anyone, what did the Pact offer that the Council didn't? Brock Harlan wanted to retaliate. "We need to make leaving expensive. Transit restrictions, trade penalties, technology sharing revocations." I vetoed it. "That is the Council's playbook," I said. "We do not punish departure. We make staying worthwhile." Worthwhile how? We can't match the Council's fleet, their infrastructure, their prestige. We've been building for 10 years. They've been building for 12 centuries. Then we offer what they can't. Which is what? I didn't have an answer, not yet. The answer came from an unlikely source. Logan Mercer, a 26-year-old human xenolinguist who had been working in the PAC's cultural exchange program for 8 months. Logan was nobody. Not nobody in the pejorative sense, nobody in the structural sense. He had no rank, no authority, no political influence. He was a translator. He spent his days facilitating communication between species whose biology, cognition, and cultural frameworks were so different that even with universal translator technology, actual understanding required a human being in the room who could read context, tone, and implication across biological boundaries. He requested a meeting with me. My scheduler denied it. I was handling the defection crisis and my calendar was locked. He requested again. Denied again. He requested a third time, and this time he attached a single-page document. The document was a list of every interspecies collaborative project currently active in the Pact. There were 412 of them. Joint research initiatives, cultural exchanges, educational programs, medical partnerships, engineering collaborations, agricultural knowledge transfers, artistic exchanges. At the bottom of the list, Logan had written a single line. The Council can offer membership. It cannot offer this. I met with him. He was young, serious, slightly nervous in the way that competent junior staff are when they're suddenly talking to someone whose decisions affect billions of lives. He had brown hair, steady hands, and a way of pausing before he spoke that suggested he was translating even his own thoughts. The 5 species that defected, he said. I looked at their participation records. All 5 had minimal engagement with collaborative programs. They were trade members. They joined for economic access and left when a better economic offer appeared. That's rational behavior. It is. But look at the species that stayed. He pulled up a display. Every species with active participation in 3 or more collaborative programs has a retention rate of 98%. The ones embedded in cultural exchange, joint research, shared education, they're not staying because they can't leave. They're staying because they've built something here that doesn't exist anywhere else. Relationships. More than relationships. Entanglement. The Council offers membership in a hierarchy. We offer membership in a web. A hierarchy can be replaced by a better hierarchy. A web can't be replaced because it doesn't exist anywhere except where it was grown. I looked at the display. 412 collaborative projects. Thousands of individual connections between species that had never communicated before the Pact existed. Knowledge flowing in directions that the Council's hierarchical structure could never facilitate, because the Council's structure flowed downward from major powers to minor ones, and the Pact's structure flowed outward in every direction simultaneously. What do you need? I asked. Resources, staff, authorization to triple the cultural exchange program. And one more thing. What? Your permission to fail. Some of these projects won't work. Some species won't connect. Some collaborations will collapse. But the ones that survive will be the Pact's skeleton. Not trade routes, not patrol fleets, but actual living connections between actual living beings who have made something together and don't want to lose it. I authorized everything he asked for. Year 12. The crisis I had been dreading arrived, and it didn't come from outside. It came from us. The Cathari, the species living inside the hollowed asteroid cluster. One of our founding 7 submitted a formal complaint under the obligation framework. They accused the Dreven hierarchy of maintaining a hereditary labor caste within their own territory, a population of approximately 2 billion individuals classified as service-designated, who could not change their caste, own property, or petition for reclassification. The accusation was true. Everyone knew it was true. The Dreven caste system was ancient, deeply embedded in their culture, and critically had been documented in their membership application. They had not hidden it. They had disclosed it. And I had accepted them anyway, because the door was open, and I couldn't close it without becoming what I hated. Now the obligation framework required an independent review. Korath Sen responded with cold precision. He argued that the caste system was an internal cultural practice, that the obligation framework applied to interspecies conduct, and that reviewing a member's domestic governance exceeded the Pact's mandate. He was right. The obligation framework's language was ambiguous on this point. I had written it hastily, under pressure, trying to balance Torek's demand for standards against my own refusal to become the council. The ambiguity was not an accident, it was a scar, the place where my competing impulses had failed to resolve. The Cathari pressed the complaint. The originals supported them. The Drevin coalition threatened withdrawal, not just the Drevin, but the 7 species that had followed them out of the council. If they left, the pact would lose 140 billion people, a significant portion of its military capability, and the political credibility that came from having a former council major power as a member. I was in my office. It was 3 a.m. I was alone. No, that's not true. I was in my office and Torek was there because Torek was always there when things broke. "You didn't write the 3rd paragraph," he said, "and now the ambiguity you left in the framework is being used as a weapon. If I rule against the Drevin, they leave and take 7 species with them. Yes. If I rule for the Drevin, I validate a caste system that keeps 2 billion people in hereditary servitude. Yes. There's no good option. There is no clean option. There is a good one. Which is, rule honestly, acknowledge the ambiguity, refer the question to the full membership for a binding vote on whether the obligation framework applies to internal governance, and accept the result. If the vote goes against the Drevin, they leave. Then they leave, and the pact survives as a thing worth surviving as. Or the vote goes for the Drevin, and the pact survives as a thing that looked at hereditary servitude and decided it was someone else's problem. And you spend the rest of your career knowing you built a door that 2 billion people on the wrong side of a caste line cannot walk through. I put my head in my hands. Torek, I'm tired. I know. I've been doing this for 12 years. I was a soybean permit guy. I was not built for this. No one is built for this. That is why it matters that you are here. A person built for this would find it easy, and a person who finds it easy would make the wrong choice. The vote was held 17 days later, in the Forge's main assembly chamber. All 53 current member species were represented. The question was simple. Does the obligation framework extend to internal governance practices that violate the Pact's founding principles? I sat in the gallery and watched. I did not speak. I did not lobby. I did not advocate. For the first time in 12 years, I let the thing I had built make its own decision without my hand on the mechanism. The vote was 37-16. The obligation framework applied to internal governance. Korath Sen stood, looked at me across the chamber and spoke. "We will comply," he said. "Not because you compel us, because the pact has spoken. And if we claim to value collective governance, we must accept what collectivity decides." A pause. "You should know that my government will require assistance. Dismantling a caste system that has existed for 9 centuries is not done by vote. It is done by education, economic restructuring, legal revision, and the sustained commitment of every species that voted today to help with the work they just mandated." He looked across the chamber, not at me, at everyone. "You voted for this. Now own it." The assembly authorized a joint reconstruction task force within the hour. The Resk, the Tassari, the Morith, the Orvani, and 4 human delegations volunteered immediately. Caleb Meng, 63 years old, still carrying his hand-drawn map, volunteered to coordinate logistics. Logan Mercer was assigned to lead the cultural liaison team. 3 months after the Drevin vote, Vasek Tone came to the Forge. Not as a negotiator, not with a delegation or a proposal or an offer. He came alone, through unofficial channels, on a Tassari commercial transport, and he asked to see me. I met him in the observation lounge, the one with the full viewport that showed the trade flow display overlaid against the actual star field. Lines of light moving across the dark, ships carrying goods, people, knowledge, between 53 species that had been strangers a decade ago. Vasek stood at the viewport for a long time without speaking. He was older than the last time I'd seen him. The silver gray of his skin had deepened, and there was a slowness in his movements that hadn't been there before. "You rejected our offer," he said finally. "The boundary agreement, the membership criteria, the military cap." "I did. That was the correct decision." He turned from the viewport. "I designed that offer to contain you, to freeze the pact at its current size and capability, and let the council absorb you gradually over the next century through economic dependency. You saw through it. I didn't see through it. My people argued me out of accepting. That's the same thing. The council doesn't have people who argue its leaders out of mistakes. We have people who argue our leaders into consensus. It's not the same, and the difference is why I'm here. Why are you here, Ambassador? He looked at me with those deep-set dark eyes that I had once found impenetrable and now recognized as simply tired. The Drevin vote. We watched it. The Council's intelligence service has 17 analysts assigned to the Pact. I'm telling you this because you already know, and all 17 submitted independent reports. Do you know what they all said? I can guess. They said the Pact was going to fracture. They said the Drevin would leave, the coalition would collapse, and the Pact would revert to a minor trade bloc within 2 years. He paused. Every model we ran, every game theory, every historical analogy, every simulation predicted fracture, because every model is calibrated against the Council's history, and in the Council's history, when a major member is challenged on internal governance, they leave. Every time, without exception. The Drevin didn't leave. The Drevin didn't leave, and our analysts cannot explain why, which means our models are broken, which means the Pact is operating on a logic we don't understand, which means the Council cannot predict you, cannot contain you, and cannot absorb you, and a thing that a 1,200-year-old institution cannot model is either a threat or a lesson. Which do you think it is? Vasek was quiet for a long time. I think, he said, that when we voted to exclude you, we made a mistake we did not understand at the time. We thought we were protecting the Council from a disruptive element. What we actually did was give you a reason to build something better, and then we spent 12 years watching you do it while telling ourselves it wouldn't work. He reached into his diplomatic case and withdrew a small data crystal. This is a formal request, unofficial, personal, not sanctioned by the Council, for me to observe the Pact's operations for 6 months. Not as a spy, not as a negotiator, as a student. A student. I am 712 years old, Mr. Morrow. I have been a diplomat for 5 centuries, and the thing you built in a cargo bay on a RESC station has done something in 12 years that the Council has not done in 1200. It made a major civilization change a fundamental aspect of its culture through collective moral pressure applied without military force. I don't understand how. I would like to. I took the crystal. You understand I'll have to consult my leadership. I understand you'll have to argue with Brock Harlan and negotiate with Korath Sen, and listen to Caleb Meng tell you a metaphor about the ocean. I understand your process, Mr. Morrow. I've been studying it for 12 years. I don't understand it, but I recognize it. I need to talk about the word empire, the title that followed us, that the media on 1,000 worlds used, that the Council's internal reports referenced with increasing frequency, that our critics wielded like an accusation and our supporters wore like a badge. They made their own empire. I hated that word. I hated it because empires dominate, and the Pact was designed to cooperate. Empires extract, and the Pact was designed to exchange. Empires centralize, and the Pact was designed to distribute. Every structural choice I had made was specifically, deliberately, architecturally opposed to the logic of empire. And it didn't matter, because from the outside, from the vantage point of the Council, the unaligned species, the galactic media, a political entity of 53 species and 400 billion individuals with a defense fleet, a trade network, and the ability to change a major civilization's internal governance through collective action, looked exactly like an empire. The function was different. The silhouette was the same. Year 14 was the year I had to confront this. 6 new species petitioned for membership in a single month, more than any previous period. 3 of them were from deep inside Council space. 2 were species that had been Council members for centuries. 1 was the Morvaini, a civilization of 90 billion individuals who had been core Council members since the institution's founding. The Morvaini, a founding member of the Council, wanting to join the Pact. The news broke, and the galaxy changed shape. I want to be honest here because the narrative that formed later, the one that historians would study, the one that Logan Mercer's cultural exchange programs would teach to mixed species classrooms, was clean, purposeful, and slightly false. The narrative said, James Morrow built the Pact of Open Seas as an alternative to the Council's exclusionary model, and the alternative was so successful that it attracted even the Council's founders. That's true. It's also incomplete. The complete truth is that by year 14, I was not in control of the Pact, not in the way I had been in year 1 or year 3 or even year 8. The framework had developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own appetite. Decisions were being made by committees I hadn't formed. Policies were being implemented by departments I hadn't authorized. And the cultural exchange programs that Logan had built were generating connections and commitments that operated entirely below my awareness. The Pact was alive. It was doing things I hadn't designed. Some of those things were beautiful. The joint Thasari human engineering program had produced a new class of medical transport that could adapt to any atmospheric composition. The Resk-Villani Chemical Research Initiative had developed a water purification system that was being deployed on 13 worlds. The Dreven caste reform, supported by the Joint Task Force, was progressing faster than anyone had predicted, driven not by external pressure but by the Dreven themselves, who had discovered that the collaborative framework gave them tools their own hierarchical system couldn't provide. And some of those things concerned me. The defense fleet Brock Harlan's project had grown to 480 vessels, not because I had authorized growth, but because member species were contributing ships voluntarily, building to the shared threshold class specification, integrating into the Pact's command structure without being asked. They did it because they wanted to belong, and contribution was the mechanism of belonging. The trade network had expanded to the point where 17% of all interstellar commerce in the galaxy flowed through Pact channels, not because of policy, but because the network was more efficient, more responsive, and more flexible than the Council's centralized trade administration. And the membership queue, the line of species waiting to join, had grown to 23 pending applications, with more arriving every week. The Pact was succeeding. It was succeeding so thoroughly that it was becoming the dominant interstellar institution by default, not by design. And an institution that becomes dominant by default is one that has never had to decide whether it wants the power it's accumulating. I called an emergency session of the Leadership Council. We need to talk about what we're becoming, I said. The meeting lasted 3 days. It was the hardest conversation I'd ever facilitated, harder than the Dreven crisis, harder than the embargo, harder than the Council's negotiation offer. The room was full of people I trusted, people I had built this framework alongside, people who had risked their careers and their species' futures on the strength of 2 paragraphs and a door, and they disagreed with each other more fundamentally than at any point in the Pact's history. Brock Harlan. We are the largest cooperative security entity in the galaxy. We need to acknowledge that and exercise the responsibility that comes with it. Torek Voss. We are not a security entity. We are a cooperation framework that has a security component. The distinction matters. Korath Sen. The distinction matters less than the reality. Whether you call it cooperation or empire, 400 billion people are looking to this institution for governance, and governance requires authority. Caleb Meng. Authority is exactly what we were built to distribute, not concentrate. Logan Mercer. The species in the cultural exchange programs don't experience the Pact as authority. They experience it as community. The question isn't what we call ourselves, it's whether we can scale community to galactic size without losing what makes it work. Travis Chen. You can't. Communities have limits. What works at 53 species does not work at 150. At some point you need structure. Torek. We have structure. The obligation framework. Brock. The obligation framework is a gentleman's agreement enforced by peer pressure. It worked for the Dreven because the Dreven chose to comply. What happens when someone doesn't? Silence. A long one. Then we vote, I said. We refer the question to the membership and we accept the result, and we apply the consequences collectively. And if the consequences require force? Brock asked. Then we apply force collectively, proportionally, and with the full transparency of the Pact's decision-making process. That's an empire, James. You just described an empire. No, I described a democracy that's willing to enforce its own decisions. Those are not the same thing. From the outside, they look identical. Then the outside is wrong. The Morvani petition sat on my desk for 47 days. I could not bring myself to process it. Every time I picked it up, I felt the architecture in my chest. The cold structural thing, now vast, now stretching across light years, now connected to 400 billion lives, grind against itself in the place where the door met the frame. If I accepted the Morvani, a founding council member joining the pact would effectively end the council's claim to represent galactic civilization. The pact would become the dominant institution not by aspiration, but by gravitational pull. The council would contract, weaken, and eventually dissolve or be absorbed. We would win, completely, permanently, and I would have built the thing I had been running from, an empire. Not by choice, but by accumulation. Not by design, but by the simple, terrible mathematics of a door that never closed. I called Torek. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. I have been honest with you for 14 years. It has not always been appreciated. Is the pact an empire? A pause, long even by Torek's standards. No, he said. But it is standing in the place where an empire would stand, and the galaxy cannot tell the difference. And if you cannot find a way to make the difference visible, then the label will become the truth. How do I make the difference visible? You do the one thing an empire never does. Which is? You let them in, not the Morvani, not one more species. You let the council in. You open the pact to the council itself, not its members individually, but the institution. You offer partnership, not absorption. You give them a place inside the framework, without requiring them to dissolve. You make the pact so obviously not an empire that even the word stops fitting. Torek, the council excluded us. They silenced me at a podium and voted 11-1 to lock us out. Yes, and you spent 14 years proving they were wrong. The question now is whether proving them wrong is the same thing as proving you're right, or whether you need to do one more thing. What thing? Forgive them, not as a gesture, as a structural act. Design forgiveness into the architecture. Make the pact a place where the council can exist alongside you without surrendering. Because a galaxy with two institutions is a galaxy with a choice. And a galaxy with a choice is a galaxy that doesn't need an empire. I submitted the proposal to the Leadership Council on a Tuesday morning. It was 4 pages long, the shortest document I had produced in 14 years. It proposed, the Pact of Open Seas would formally invite the Council of Aligned Civilizations to enter a partnership framework, not as a member, not as a subordinate, but as a parallel institution with reciprocal obligations, shared projects, and mutual accountability under a jointly authored charter. The door I had built would not absorb the council. It would extend to include them, creating a space large enough for both institutions to exist, collaborate, and check each other. Brock Harlan voted against. He wanted the council to dissolve and join as individual species. Korath Sen voted against. He wanted the pact to formalize as the dominant institution and negotiate from strength. Travis Chen voted against. He thought the council would use the partnership to infiltrate and undermine. 20 members voted, 12 voted in favor, 8 voted against. It passed. Vasek Tone, still on the forge, still officially a student, still watching with those deep, dark, tired eyes, found me in the observation lounge after the vote. You know this may not work, he said. I know. The council may reject it. They have 12 centuries of institutional pride. They may not be able to accept partnership with an entity they voted to exclude 14 years ago. I know. And even if they accept, the integration will be messy, contentious, and slow. It will take decades. You may not live to see it completed. I know that too. Then why? I looked at the viewport, the trade flow display lines of light connecting 53 species across the dark. Ships moving, knowledge moving, people moving toward each other through distances that should have been impossible. Because I was 31 years old and standing at a podium, and they turned off my microphone before I could say a word. And I spent 14 years building a response to that moment. And the response grew, and it worked, and it became something I didn't design and couldn't fully control. And now I'm standing in an empire that I keep insisting isn't an empire. And the only way to prove it, the only way to make the architecture match the principle, is to do the thing an empire can't do. Which is, open the door to the people who closed it on me. Not because they've earned it, Not because they've changed. Because the door was never about them. It was about what kind of thing I wanted to build. And an empire closes doors. And I don't want to build an empire. Vasek was quiet for a long time. You know what the council called you in the early years, after the vote? I can imagine. They called you the soybean functionary, a junior diplomat who would stamp his permits and be forgotten within a decade. They weren't wrong. That's what I was. No, Mr. Morrow, that's what you were standing on. The difference is that you kept building, and you never stopped being the person who was standing on that floor. Most people, when they build something tall, forget the ground. You never forgot the soybeans. He reached into his case and withdrew a second data crystal. This is not a personal request. This is the council's formal response to your proposal. I've been carrying it for 6 days, waiting to see if you would actually submit the invitation before I gave it to you. You knew I would? I've been studying you for 14 years, Mr. Morrow. I don't understand you, but I've learned to predict you. What does it say? It says yes. I'm writing this in my office on the Forge. It's 3 a.m. I'm 51 years old, and the Pact of Open Seas has been in existence for 20 years, and the Council Pact Joint Framework has been in operation for 6, and I still can't sleep. Not because I'm afraid. Not because the architecture in my chest is grinding. Not because the cold structural thing that was born on an observation deck 20 years ago is hungry. I can't sleep because Caleb Mung died 3 days ago, 69 years old, heart failure. On a rescue medical station and surrounded by friends from 7 species, holding his hand-drawn map, which he had carried in his jacket pocket every single day since I'd met him. The map was worthless, decades out of date. The ink faded to ghosts. The trade routes it depicted long since replaced by systems 1,000 times more sophisticated. He carried it anyway. I'm looking at it now. He left it to me. A piece of synthetic paper with lines on it, drawn by a man who saw the shape of the galaxy's future before anyone else did, and never once claimed credit for it. Logan Mercer is running the Cultural Exchange Program. Now, it spans 78 species and has produced more collaborative projects than we can count. He still pauses before he speaks. He still translates even his own thoughts. Brock Harlan retired from the Defense Fleet 2 years ago. He sent me a message that said, "You were right about the lock being too big. I'm sorry it took me 15 years to see it." I keep the message on my desk next to Caleb's map. Torek Voss is still here, still wheeling his mobility frame through the corridors of the Forge at impossible hours, still telling me when I'm wrong. He's the closest thing I have to a conscience that operates on a galactic scale. Korath Sen sends me a report every quarter on the Dreven caste reform. The last report said that 63% of formerly service-designated individuals have been reclassified, that economic mobility has increased by a factor of 9, and that the process is still painful, still slow, and still worth doing. He signs every report with the same line, "You voted for this. We are owning it." Travis Chen manages the Forge's operations. He is meticulous, irritable, and irreplaceable. He still calls me the soybean guy. Vasek Tone returned to the Council 3 years ago to lead their side of the Joint Framework Administration. We speak every week. The conversations are mostly about logistics, trade harmonization, patrol coordination, joint research funding. Sometimes at the end, one of us will pause, and the silence will fill with the weight of 20 years, and neither of us will say anything about it, and then we'll say goodnight. I want to be clear about something for whoever reads this. The Pact of Open Seas is not an empire. It is not a utopia. It is not a solution. It is an argument. An ongoing, unfinished, constantly contested argument about what interstellar civilization can be when the door stays open. Sometimes the argument goes well, sometimes it goes badly. Sometimes species join and contribute and thrive. Sometimes they join and exploit and fail. Sometimes the obligation framework works beautifully. Sometimes it produces outcomes that no one is happy with. The point was never perfection. The point was that the argument continues, that the door stays open, that no species anywhere for any reason hears the hum of a dampening field drown out the first syllable of the first word of the thing they came to say. I was banned from the council. I was silenced at a podium. I was sent home to stamp soybean permits. And I built a door, and the door is still open. And on the other side of it, 78 species are arguing about what kind of civilization they want to be, and the argument is loud and messy and occasionally infuriating, and it is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. The council called me the soybean functionary. I kept the name. It reminds me of the floor. 20 years after the vote, James Morrow stepped down as pact administrator. He was succeeded by a joint leadership council composed of representatives from every member species. His official title was retired. His unofficial title, the one that appeared on a hand-painted sign above his desk in the small apartment he maintained on the forge until his death at age 73, read, James Morrow Soybeans, the door he built is never closed.